Hello, this is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. I'm a big fan of Kiss Looms. I greatly enjoy mine, and I am cooperating with Kelly at Kiss Looms to make you a playlist of all the basic techniques that you might ever want to know on all of the looms. So welcome and enjoy. Let's make some washing cloths with the nifty yarn I have found just to do it. This is a product by Mary Maxim, and as far as I know, this is the only yarn of this kind. If you should happen to know of others, I would like to hear about it. This one says it's 100% cotton with fringe, and it is a number 4 yarn. And let's look at its construction. I'm going to put this white piece of paper down so you can see. This is like a knitted ribbon with fringe on it. And the result is that it makes a terry cloth-like texture. Its scrubbiness is comparable to a fine loofah, not the coarsest ones, but I really like it. And I've been trying a couple of different ways of working with this. Have a look at my loom. This is a regular gauge Kiss loom. 2 sides of it are set up with 3 washers between the pin and the pegboards. 2 are set up with no washers, and I have made cloths in both ways, and I like them both. This is the one set up with the wider spacing, and this one is 24 pegs, 34 rows, 3 washers with the double E-wrap cast on and the transfer bind off. Since then, I've decided the double E-wrap cast on is not ideal because it flares a little. But it's a presentable cloth, and I've actually already used this one and enjoyed using it very much. When we finish up, let's weave in these last yarn tails the easy way. You could use a crochet hook to do this same job. I personally prefer a latch tool or a latch needle from a knitting machine. Now I can just snip the last end. And particularly in this yarn with the fuzzy feature, it is not going to work back out of the stitches that I've woven it through. Under, over, under, over. That's what that hook is doing. Grab the yarn tail, pull it through. So that's how we finish it up. Now this one is just off the loom. It has not been washed, and it has some differences. Note that the ends curl a little bit untreated. The edges, very, very little. They just draw in a little bit extra. So a refinement was to do the same stitch and row count as the first one, 24 stitches, 34 rows, but make the first 2 rows seed stitch, knit 1, purl 1, and then on the second row purl the knits and knit the purls. The body is stockinette, and we finished with seed stitch. Still need to weave these ends in, still need to wash the cloth because it will fluff up and achieve a nicer character as soon as it's washed. Now this one was made without any washers. Let's compare the fabrics and the gauge. Of course, it did come out just a little bit smaller, not terribly much, and it's a little bit denser. It will appear more dense too after it's washed, but look at my hand through there. You can see the shadow of it, but you're not seeing much skin. On this looser cloth, you can see a little bit more through. It's entirely a matter of personal taste, which one you would prefer to make. If you wanted to make this on a small gauge loom, you certainly could. I think it will be just a little bit more difficult because working with our ribbon type yarn, being able to see where we're putting the tool right here is helpful, but it is not essential. If you wanted to get the same 2 cloths on a small gauge loom, I think you would use 2 to 3 washers for the tighter one and 4 to 5 for the looser one. It's going to depend somewhat on your style, your personal way of doing things. Let's cast on for a cloth. And the cast on would be the same no matter which gauge you decided to make. I'm going to use the long tail cast on, and I have other videos that go into great detail about this. So this will be an overview. First, we're going to measure 3 times the length of the number of pegs that we're actually going to use. And then, I think I'm going to make this one loose. I always am a little bit generous, just erring on the side of safety. I knot a loop into that and hang the loop on the first peg. Now we're going to treat the 2 pieces of yarn as though they were completely separate. The one that has an end on it, we use to E-wrap the next peg. The strand that's part of the main ball, we use to U-wrap that same peg, knit over the E-wrap, knit the U-wrap over the E-wrap, and tighten the tail a little bit. And repeat. E-wrap with one strand, U-wrap with the other, knit over, and tighten. Don't over tighten. Now I'm going to continue with this cast on while I talk a little bit about working with this kind of yarn. First of all, it's 100% cotton, and as is traditional with cotton, it has almost no stretch. So it's essential that you not do anything with it that's overly tight. If you do, you will make it very difficult on yourself and on the yarn and on the loom, and to no advantage. Tightly knitted cotton is not better in any way. I should tighten this loom. It shouldn't be flexing like that. But I'm going to continue for the moment and tighten it once I'm off camera. Another thing is this ribbon yarn, you may have the impression, oh, being ribbon, it should lay flat on the pegs. It's not that important. If this twists, I wouldn't worry about it. That's twisting. And it's really part of the nature of the yarn to get those little fringy hairs poking out every different direction. That makes the fabric what it is. So don't worry about it. However, you do need to leave it loose enough that you can easily knit it over and that you don't stress the yarn. And you do need to avoid accidentally poking your tool into holes in the yarn. It needs to pick up the whole strand every time. So I will knit on around the corner, and we'll get back together when we've both cast on. Oh, before I go, let me say that to get 6.5 to 7-inch square cloths, I'm using 24 pegs. That means that you could do this on the inexpensive little 24 peg loom without any problem, the smallest Kiss loom. But you can also do it on a larger loom simply by only using 24 pegs. Of course, we're not trying to make a circle. We're trying to make a panel, so you knit back and forth. You don't join the ends and go round and round if you use a 24 peg loom. Also, there is no rule that says your cloths have to be this size. You could knit 30 or 40 pegs and make a wider cloth, and then you would want to make it longer as well, most likely. I did make a cute little soap bag using this yarn and this technique and the 24 peg loom, which this is actually 2 24 peg looms put together. So if you can picture these two sides flipped over here, I knitted that one round and round and made a bag in which a bar of soap fit perfectly. And that makes a nice scrubby bath treat. The soap is contained inside. You can also use it as a soap saver bag and use your scraps of soap in there, and they wash just as well, either dishes or people. So we're just about done with the cast on. And you can see why we needed 3 times the length of the loom. This E-wrapping takes some yarn length. When we get done, the cast on will be complete, and we'll need to knit 2 rows of seed stitch. Seed stitch is knit 1, purl 1, and knitting and purling alternately prevent the fabric from rolling in both directions. We'll just drop our yarn tail through and get it out of the way. We're done with that. Knit. The first row is the hardest because they tend to be a little bit tighter, the stitches of the cast on do, than the remainder of the knitting. That's a purl. We'll knit and purl. You may use whichever style of knitting and purling suits you. If you want to use the purling tool, you can. If you want to knit across where you do all the purls and then go back and do all the knits, you can. If you want to attempt the continuous knit and purl stitch, you can. I'll attempt it here for a moment. I don't think it's ideal with this yarn, but we'll see. That was a purl, so we're ready to knit, which is wrap above, purl, which is wrap below, knit, wrap above, purl, wrap below, knit, wrap above. I always do my last stitch so as not to lose the yarn. This is a purl. This is a knit. This is a purl. My lack of tightening up has come back to get me, bad me. And this is a knit. That was a purl, that was a knit, so we're ready for a purl. And I'll see you when I get over here. Finished up the first row of seed stitch. This one was a purl, this one was a knit. Throughout this project, we're going to slip the first stitch of every row. That just means don't wrap it and don't knit it. Therefore, the first stitch I'm really going to knit is this one, and it was a purl last row, so this time I'm going to knit it. One nice thing about this project is that there is very little purling, so if you're a new knitter and purling is still not your favorite thing, take heart, you don't have to do very much of it. This is a knit stitch, and the next is a purl. And I will go all the way around doing the same thing, and see you over there, and then we'll start on the body of our cloth. Okay, our cast on is completed, as are our first 2 rows, which are seed stitch, alternating knit and purls. Now for this row and for the remainder of the cloth, we're simply going to knit with the normal U-stitch knit stitch, the one most common to kiss looms. If you are making exactly the same cloth that I have with the 24 stitches by 34 rows, this means that we've already knitted rows 1 and 2, and that rows 33 and 34 will be seed stitch. So that leaves 30 rows of stockinette stitch, U-stitch, that we'll be knitting here. You do not have to count. I'll show you how to measure in a minute. But if you do want to count, I'll show you how to count rows now. Everybody thinks they have to have a row counter or something. And you can if you want. There's no harm in it. But you can just count the rows of stitches by finding the little hole. 1, there are 2 below this, so it's actually 3, 4. There's the hole, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can do this with the fabric on the loom. So if you lose count, no big deal, just count up. Now in a normal knitted fabric, you can also count the little heart shapes. In this, it's a little trickier because these fringes are getting in the way and obscuring your heart shapes. But since we're knitting loose fabric, see those like rungs of a ladder? Every single one of them represents a row, or every single hole between them represents a row. Count one or the other, and you'll do fine. Although this is just stockinette with a slipped first stitch on every row, you can see that it doesn't roll very much, really not at all up the edges. So I'm not bothering to do anything more about it than that. Slip the first stitch, which simply means in this case don't wrap it, don't knit it. And the body of the cloth is created by you wrapping and knitting over every stitch, just like this. This is the most common of the Kiss Loom stitches and the one that you're most familiar with. Now here's what I want you to take note of. Really, this yarn is like two pieces of tape or ribbon. Make sure that you do not get the tool into a hole in the ribbon, because those exist. That's part of what creates the texture. Separate the two and knit the bottom one over the top, lifting up the entire bottom loop on your tool. I've experimented with some various tools. The white-handled ones that come for free along with your Kiss Loom. My usually favorite one that I made myself, and this Deluxe Kiss tool. And by far, the Deluxe Kiss tool does the best job of knitting this yarn. So if you have one or can get one, I strongly recommend it. Not that the others won't do it, they will. But this makes the experience more foolproof and more fun. So for the body of the cloth, till it gets within an inch of the length you want, just use the U-wrap knit stitch and slip the beginning stitch of every row. Let's knit these over and start the next row to cement in your mind how it works. All right, this is the last stitch that I just knitted, but it becomes the first stitch of the next row. So I'll just let the yarn come off the back of that stitch, don't do anything else about this peg, and begin wrapping the other direction. We began with seed stitch so as to prevent curl at the bottom edge. So we'll want to finish with seed stitch so the two ends match. And you can count rows if you want to. I happen to know I've got 32 rows on here now, but there is an easier way. Measure the approximate width, and it will be approximate because this fabric is very changeable. This is about 7 inches, just a little bit under. Now, when we reach 6.5 inches or so, it's time to switch to seed stitch so as to make a square. And there we are. I personally don't care greatly if it's a perfect square. If you do care greatly, you're going to need to do careful swatching and do the math. So now we're going to start doing seed stitch, which is knit one. We're still slipping the beginning stitch of every row. Knit this one, purl the next one, and we'll knit and purl alternately all the way across the row. Now you can do what I just am doing this time if you want. You can wrap the knits but not knit them off. Work the purls one at a time. And then come back and do the knits. And some people find that a little faster. Do it however you like, and I'll meet you over here. We're at the last couple of stitches in the row that I just started with you. This stitch is a knit stitch, and this stitch is a purl stitch. And it's important to keep that straight because we're going to slip the first stitch here as usual, and then whatever this was in the row previous, we will need to start with the opposite item. So this knitted, and this time it purls. And that starts off our row. Now we just have to alternate all the way across. Knit, purl, knit, purl. Seed stitch alternates one knit and one purl, both across the row and up the rows. You could also knit ribbing, which is knit one, purl one, but the same up the columns of stitches. So it's knit one, purl one all the time, instead of sometimes purl one, knit one. Seed stitch on alternate rows, you purl the knits and knit the purls. That was a purl, so I'm ready for a knit. And I'm going to go on back to my first peg, and I will meet you there. All right, we've finished 2 rows of seed stitch. Knit, purl, knit, purl. Now it's time to bind off. You can bind off however you want, but I'll tell you that the bind off I've been most satisfied with is the transfer bind off. Worked like this. Transfer stitch 1 to peg 2. Wrap. Now notice in this case I wrapped around the pin, which you never do. But I'll show you why it's going to be all right. I'm going to knit the 2 stitches that are now on the peg over the new wrap. And I'm going to lift that new stitch off, and I'm going to lift it off the pin. And the purpose of the placement of the yarn around the pin, as I just did, is simply to keep it from over tightening the bind off. It's just a spacer, which is what the pins always are. And if you were to ever use it for any other reason, working around the pin, and you were in the middle of your knitting, you would have to be extra careful to lift the knitting off of the pin, as I'm doing here. As it happens, since this is the very last row, if I left something on the pin, it would be obvious as I moved the fabric off of the loom. So it wouldn't be a disaster. But this is a very exceptional situation. Normally you want to avoid including the pins in anything you're doing. So this is the transfer bind off, because we're moving 1 stitch to the next peg, and then they're knitted off as though they were a single stitch. And you can see the edge we're making, and it's a pretty good match for our cast on, which was the long tail cast on. So I'll see you when I get over here. Let's finish this cloth up doing the last few stitches of the bind off. Still doing the transfer bind off. Transfer 1 stitch to the next peg. Wrap that peg including the pin, just for spacing. Lift the stitch off both the peg and the pin. Move it to the next one and repeat. And for this very last one, we'll not only knit it off, we'll snip the end and pull it through. And here we go. This one has not been washed at all. It will resume a little bit more stable shape once it has. And these little hairs will begin to pop out. You can see the effect on this one. There are some other differences between these 2 cloths. Remember, this one was set with the loom knitting at a looser gauge, and it has no seed stitch top and bottom. And this is a double E-wrap cast on, which now that I have a little bit more experience, I've decided against because it flares out a little bit too much. It's not a disaster. This is just a washcloth, but to get a little bit nicer edge, I recommend now that we begin with the long tail cast on and end with the transfer bind off.